Thank you so much, Carmen, also. It's a delight to be here in Budapest. And first of all, I should send greetings from the Thatcher Foundation to our new sister, the Danube Institute. It's always a pleasure to find that there are new siblings in the scheme of things, and I wish you the very best. John, I've known 20 years. I won't try and match his very kind words. All I can say is that he has always demonstrated to me in all our dealings the sharpest intellect, the best of convictions, and a kind of wit at the service of both. He's one of the funniest men I know, but never does he make a joke that hasn't got some purpose or point. He knows everyone, he's read it all. And somehow he manages to mix together these qualities and make it seem the most ordinary thing in the world. Haven't we all met everyone and read it all? I want to pay tribute as well to someone else who's in the audience today. Just behind John is a young lady called Margaret Thatcher. Anita emailed me at the website about a year ago, perhaps slightly more now, saying, I would like to come and work for you for a bit. I found some money to be an intern. I didn't know a great deal about Hungary at this point, but I thought, no, this is interesting. I know Mrs. Thatcher had an interest in Hungary. It was rather important at one point, particularly. So I will pursue this a little. I took up a CV. And what I discovered, I think there are two kinds of interns. Some of you have been interns. There are interns who are hard-working, and then there are interns that are merely hard work. And there's no question Anita belongs in the first class. She worked incredibly hard. She's in the first class of the first class. And if any of you need some kind of research help, just approach me and I will put you in touch. She's a superb researcher, and in fact the Balashi Institute has snapped her up, but you never know, she might have a bit of free time. Okay, that is my grace notes. Let me begin. Thatcher, Reagen and the Hungarian Compromise, 1979 to 84. That is my topic. It's 30 years since Margaret Thatcher came to Budapest. Looking at the audience, I think most of you won't have been born in 1984. But when she died last year, I think a lot of the TV coverage in this country did actually echo that, lead back to that event when she visited the Central Market and bought garlic and honey and paprika. She made an impact on that visit, and it made an impact the other way around. It was her first visit to an Eastern Bloc country, and she descends on a foggy and snowbound Budapest just for 2 days, very brief. Hungary was a relatively small, stable and prosperous member of the Eastern Bloc in those days. It had not really featured on the British political agenda very much for a long time. And in fact, when Mrs. Thatcher was told at the end of 1979, a few months into her premiership, by one of her outgoing civil service team that he wanted to be the next ambassador to Budapest, she said rather tactlessly, but in very much the way she used to operate, Hungary? Hungary? How boring, she said. But time caused her to revise that view. And what this paper is about is how she came to think that Hungary wasn't boring at all. Now, when the private secretary I mentioned, a man called Brian Cartledge, took up his embassy here in January 1980, of course she was very happy to grant his reward. He worked very hard. There was unquestionably a kind of static, backwater feel to Budapest from a British point of view. And his first dispatches, which we put online, along with many other documents, about 200 documents are on this website about this subject. They are what you might call superior specimens of a dismal craft. There was a thing called Kremlinology, which your predecessors had to read a great deal of, I expect, at some point. Certainly people in my generation in Oxford had to read it. And what you did when you were a criminologist was try and squeeze insight from the smallest detail. We knew nothing really very much of the Soviet bloc. It gave us very little. So you had to spin out the little bits you had to make a story. And even less forgivably, criminologists who had little to say wrote at some length. That's what the way sometimes when you have little material you spin it out longer and longer. And the result was that Cartledge's early dispatches, which certainly weren't read by Margaret Thatcher, tended to be dismissed in the Foreign Office. Nobody was very interested in them. But we can trace the British view of Hungary at that point, and it's worth reflecting on it. We saw it in a sort of paradoxical way. And paradox was always a kind of ominous thing in our analysis, because it implied that there were forces unresolved that might work themselves out, perhaps dangerously. We saw tension in Hungary. Stable on the surface, perhaps, but what might happen? That was always the question that British analysts asked. What could happen in the future? We saw a regime based on what Cartledge called repressive tolerance. It was loyally Soviet in its foreign policy, but attached to a modest policy of economic liberalisation, which was giving a higher standard of living than many other countries in the Eastern Bloc, but with the help very much of Western credit, of which I will say more later. The communist leader, János Kádár, had grown old in the job and had a bloody beginning in it, which nobody ever forgot. Nobody forgot 1956 in the West any more than they did in Hungary. Yet now, by 1979-80, he was a grandfatherly protector from the Soviets, an idea that many people in Britain accepted, and even, I think, here. He was even relatively fit for his age in 1980-84 as well. And that was a powerful asset at a time when the health problems of the Soviet leaders like Brezhnev and Andropov were a major factor in politics. If you could look at the leader and say he's going to be here for 3 or 4 years more, that was an asset. Now, British ministerial interest in Hungary was pretty limited, to be honest with you. No British Prime Minister had ever visited, as far as anyone could find out. And it's a rather telling detail that when they looked into the files, they couldn't really figure it. They weren't sure, actually. No one knew. The Foreign Secretary at the time, Lord Carrington, held a meeting with his Hungarian counterpart, a man called Puya, in Vienna in May 1980. And there's a note on the record of what happened, very short, by officials. It said, Mr. Puya made a not very good impression on the Secretary of State. Full stop. That was it. Not much use. By comparison, strangely, one of the odd paradox things about Hungary, the Communist Party was seen as a bit of a haven of intellect by comparison with the government itself. Calling on a senior party official, Brian Cartledge wrote admiringly, quotes, his office was more like that of a Harvard professor than a communist apparatchik. That dispatch is on the website. Stranger still, we thought the party was almost the only institution in the country that the Soviets hadn't filled with agents. So you could actually talk to the party in some confidence without having the Soviets listening. Towards the end of his first year in the job, Cartledge summed it all up in a series of dispatches to London he called the Hungarian Quartet. A bit grandly, perhaps. These were given a rather warmer welcome in London than the previous ones had done, and they were used to brief our Secretary of State, Lord Carrington, who was going to get a second dose of Mr. Puya, his unloved counterpart in Budapest. But the truth is that the market for things Hungarian was suddenly rising in London, and there's a single word for the explanation: Poland. As Poland began to hit difficulties, so everybody in the West began to think about Hungary. Were you going to be next? Was there going to be a crisis that spread from one country to the next? How long, in other words, could the Hungarian compromise, and the phrase is Brian Cartledge's, how long could that really last? Now, the West's response to this Polish crisis, so vast that I can't begin to address the thing in detail at all, proved vital to the evolution of British and American policy in Hungary. Following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, Kádár had done what he always did. He towed the line with the Soviets and kept his head down. Basically, should we see if we can stop that? You could deal with that. He hoped to limit the damage. There was bound to be some damage, but he limited it, particularly in economic terms. Hungary did its best to stay in with its economic relations in the West. Poland, however, was a different matter. It proved a lot more dangerous and damaging for Hungary, and he really couldn't duck it in quite the same way. Now, there were two phases in the Polish crisis, before and after martial law, which was declared on the 13th of December 1981. We had a speech last night at dinner for the Danube Institute addressed by the Polish Foreign Secretary, Radek Sikorski, who of course was then a young member of Solidarity, so he had something to say about martial law. It had a huge impact in the West. And the response in the Reagan administration, newly in office, to the declaration of martial law was a punitive one. Whereas in the previous phase of the crisis, the West had generally just about held together, splits now opened spectacularly between the Western allies. So that is the situation you have to grasp. The West divides, the Americans want sanctions, and top of the target that the Americans want to sanction is a huge infrastructure project called the Siberian Gas Pipeline. Then as now, energy was always at the heart of politics, particularly Soviet politics. This was a project to sell Soviet gas to Western Europe, construction of which was essentially financed by the customers. European politicians, especially German, saw the project as something that would ease Cold War tensions. If you trade with the other side, that makes everybody a bit happier. You give the Soviets some hard currency and they could buy some goods from the West. That will help things too. They might buy German goods too. That's even better. On the other side, the Reagan administration pointed out the obvious dangers of relying on Soviet gas. What if they turned it off? And what would they use that cash for? Do you really think they're going to buy lots of German cars? Might they not buy things for other purposes, military things, for example? What they sought to do was to choke off credit to the East. This was the response that the Reagan administration had above all to Poland. Deny them hard currency. Stop the Soviets amassing the war chest that they could use against us. And a very nasty transatlantic argument developed about the whole range of sanctions focused on this particular project of the pipeline. The president himself was personally scornful of Allied responses to Polish martial law. There's a meeting of the National Security Council on the 22nd of December, the week after martial law. We have the record online, you can read it there. And he dismisses, it's a very sharp statement from a man who was very laid back, said very little in meetings, but here he really speaks. And he says of European leaders, including Margaret Thatcher incidentally, no exceptions for her, he called them chicken littles. He warned, if we really believe this is the last chance of a lifetime, a revolution started against this damned force, his words, we should let our allies know that they too will pay a price if they don't go along, that we have long memories. That's said privately, that's not for public consumption, but that tells you how strongly he felt about this, how much pressure was going to be put on Western allies to come up with serious sanctions against the Soviets in this situation. Now, Margaret Thatcher was quite correctly seen as Ronald Reagan's closest ally in Europe. But actually, she deeply resented this package of sanctions. For one thing, even though they were designed and implemented from the United States, they affected British firms. And she was always annoyed by what was called extraterritorial application of this kind. They also were retrospective, so you could sign a contract in 1978 and find that it was illegal in 1981. And she didn't like that. She was a lawyer by training. And she felt that the Western Europeans were going to have to pay the price of this. She noticed, for example, that one of the things the president did in the run-up to these sanctions was exempt a US company, Caterpillar, which was going to make truck equipment for the pipeline. They wouldn't be sanctioned, he said. Also, he'd ended the US grain embargo, which Carter had imposed on the Soviets, again benefiting US interests. She thought this was a bit of double standards, really, on Reagan's side. And their relationship is a very interesting one. John has indeed written a whole book about it. And it's a relationship in which in public she stayed very close, but in private she would speak her mind. There was never any hesitation about telling Ronald Reagan where she stood, what she thought. And her ability to be listened to seriously was partly because in public she was so much a committed supporter. He knew that she was basically in the same position, would back him when it really counted in public. Therefore, he would actually listen and try and act on what she had to say in private. There were rumours too, I have to say, that the US was going to drive Poland to default, that the US was going to break down the Polish banking system. And she was exceptionally alarmed by that. She really didn't like the thought of a credit crash in Eastern Europe. And what she does, faced with this tremendously divisive package of US sanctions in early 1982, is to work for some common front. We will try to choke off credit to the East, but not let it split us. And it fails. She tries, but the French kill it off. There's a huge meeting in Versailles, glorious, glorious setting of Versailles in June 1982. The French kill it. The president is furious, goes home, extends the sanctions rather than narrows them. And she, in public, a rare public criticism of the president, said she felt deeply wounded by a friend. So there you are. That is kind of the background to the Hungarian question, the Hungarian compromise. Now, in one sense, the politics of the crisis in Poland was no dilemma for Kada, because all he did was do what he always did, which was to say, yes, we agree with you. Puja was just a little robot, really. You turned a button, and Puja stood up and did what he was supposed to do. He was a Gromyko for Hungary. But there was a way in which this was going to come home to Hungary, like it or not. The difficulty was that the Polish crisis crushed the Polish state. The Soviets had to move in with money to keep it going. And in order to get the cash, they began to struggle with the various arrangements in the Eastern Bloc. And on the 19th of March 1982, there's a very urgent message that comes to number 10 Downing Street. It says basically the Soviets are taking money out of Hungarian banks in the West. And those banks are going to be crushed. And everybody knows what's happening. The Soviets are killing the Hungarian banking system. They're desperate. They'd only do this as a desperate measure. And you know how rumour spreads in the markets. And basically, suddenly, Hungary is in the front line of a huge financial crisis. Now, the Hungarians have made friends in the West, there's no question. They realised they might one day need a lot of contacts in the West. And in the banking sector, they wined and they dined and they've done all the necessary things. They are immediately on the phone. And one of the things I did for this particular project, with Anita's help, we went into the archives looking for documents, and I found a huge batch of them in the Bank of England's papers covering this particular crisis, of which at the beginning I knew nothing at all. And it shows how desperately difficult it was, how close Hungary was to the very edge of collapse at that point. There would have been a complete collapse of the banking system. And the West puts together a package to rescue it through the Bank of International Settlements in Basel. They do what they always do in these situations. A small official package is there to encourage the much bigger commercial banks to stay in the game. They twist arms. There was a lot of stuff in the press about the banks being bludgeoned into keeping their money there. They talk it up. They say it's a marvellous package, but it's really not that big. And above all, they're trying to create confidence. But there's a problem. The US does not want necessarily to see this succeed. The US isn't helping with this package. They're members of the Bank of International Settlements, but they stand back. They say we're not going to contribute any cash to this. Hungary is trying to join the IMF. It succeeds in doing so in 1982, but it's not quite there. Just close, but not actually in port. And if the US slows that down just a little bit, they can kill off the rescue package that the Bank of International Settlements is coming up with. And this is the maximum moment of division about the Siberian Gas Pipeline. There are huge public fights now happening between London, Washington, Paris and Bonn about what to do in the Soviet Union. So you can see how dangerous and difficult this is. Hungary could easily be swatted out of one side in these huge arguments that are taking place about what to do. Really, at issue here was the whole basis of Western policy towards the East. For many years, certainly in the period of détente, it had been an axiom that we should practice what was called differentiation towards the Eastern Bloc. What we should do is single out for gentler treatment the states we thought were more liberal and pro-Western. Of course, these were comparative terms. If you looked at Qadar's government, was it really a liberal government? Not very. I mean, it was more pro-Western than some, I suppose, but you can see that in the Reagan administration especially, there were many people who thought this was just a delusion to suppose that there were any Eastern Bloc countries that were in any real way pro-Western, that this was just a game we were playing with ourselves. Two people particularly put the case against very powerfully in the US administration. Caspar Weinberger, a defense secretary, and Assistant Secretary Pearl, also in the Pentagon. They say very simply, with great force, it's not our job to rescue Hungary. If somebody's going to rescue Hungary, let the Soviets rescue Hungary if they can, if they want to. If they can't or don't want to, the Hungarians will soon get the message, won't they, that their friends in Moscow weren't so helpful after all. Why should we help Moscow by rescuing Hungary? That's just taking the pressure off Moscow that we are trying to put on them through sanctioning things like the gas pipeline. This is just no sense at all. We shouldn't be even thinking about helping Hungary. Now the result is that it becomes extremely difficult to get this package together. The Bank of England says to the British government, oh, the Americans are going to kill it. We're going to risk our money. We can't have that. You must guarantee us. Help us. In the event that it all goes horribly wrong, it blows up, and the Americans kill this package, a speech in which they say that Hungary shouldn't join the IMF straight away. That's enough to kill it completely. We want our money guaranteed. All very, very difficult for the British government. And particularly for Margaret Thatcher, it really puts her on the spot. What did she think about this particular rescue? Hungary's dire situation in 1982. Now, it's plain actually, she supported this idea of differentiation. She believed that we should separate out the Eastern Bloc states and see which ones were friendlier, which ones we could persuade, in some sense, to be more pro-Western. She didn't have illusions about their ability to act separately, that Hungary could break away from the Soviet bloc or something, or that it was a liberal country. She still thought there was business to be done, and she wanted, if she could, to keep this system going. She also thought, very clearly, that there could be a domino effect, that Hungary would fail this week, or Poland may be first, and then one after another, after another, after another. It's always the way with banking crises, you don't necessarily know where they're going to start. You never know where they're going to end. Because who is at the other end of the chain? It's British banks, it's American banks, it's commercial banks all the way across the Western world. How much damage will this do to us, is her thinking. And there is in fact a meeting in Brussels of the European Council, the body of heads of government, of course, that is at the centre of decision making. It meets at the end of March 1982, and I found in her archive, again I put it online, notes for her speech to the dinner at this council meeting. The dinner is where the more difficult things are broached, slightly more intimate than the big meetings with translators and so on. It's slightly friendlier. And this is what she said. Only question is which country in Eastern Europe will default first and how far collapse will spread. The US must be brought along to an appreciation of the European view on these issues. Community is much more deeply involved than US. Need for community to speak with common voice on all these issues so as to make its weight felt. That isn't quite the Margaret Thatcher that people tend to remember in Britain, at least. You see, as somebody who was very pro-American and pretty anti-Europe all through. It's not quite the correct picture when you begin to examine the detail. And her resistance to the idea of just driving Eastern Europe into collapse is absolutely crystal clear. So even though nobody in this room would have known of these debates, would have had much of an inkling of it, even those of you old enough to know it, nonetheless, at that point, she was battling for Hungary, actually. There's no question that had it gone the other way, Hungary would have had a huge crisis which you would have been learning about in your history books, and who knows what it would have done. Now the outcome in the end was Weinberger said nothing. Pearl said nothing. It went through. There was one loan, then a second, then a third, then a fourth. It goes through. People don't even remember the crisis terribly. Hungary joins the IMF. At one point in all this, Kadar comes into play. The bankers come to Budapest for a conference. And he goes along to the Parliament building for a meeting with them. I went there this afternoon. I was interested to see the Parliament, so reminiscent of Westminster. And he sees these guys for an hour. He stands up and he speaks to them without notes. He's very impressive, actually, at this stage of his life. He's no fool. He knows how to handle them. And the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England left a record of this in the bank's notes. He said, Kadar, we've been too polite not to refer to Hungary's immediate problems, but we all knew that Hungary was in difficulty on the international money markets. He ended by tackling the view that the Soviet Union could be attacked through pressure on the Eastern European countries. He said it might be possible to liquidate the Soviet satellites and perhaps Western Europe, but the USSR would remain. Kadar well understood what this crisis had been about, I think. It wasn't just about Hungary or about money. It was about the deepest aspects of policy towards Eastern Europe. He knew also something about handling the West. Now, in her plane, travelling to that European Council, where Margaret Thatcher made that remark about which one will go first, it's a question of when, not if, she discussed something completely different with her Foreign Secretary. There was a problem in the South Atlantic. Argentinian ships had been making threatening moves, and we decided to dispatch a nuclear submarine in response. 5 days later, the Falklands War began, and Lord Carrington, our Foreign Secretary, resigned. A huge, huge crisis. Now, this paper is not about the Falklands War, but it is relevant in one respect. It transformed Margaret Thatcher's international profile. It was the making of her in the United States, no question. She acquired a permanently enhanced standing in a category separate from almost every other foreign leader, the one you could call true grit. Even in Hungary, the Iron Lady seemed a more substantial figure. And during the war, there's an interesting note. Joseph Moyoy, the Deputy Prime Minister of Hungary, sought out the British ambassador to say he supported Britain's action. He thought it was a good thing that we should fight the Argentinians. It could be he said the same thing to the Argentinian ambassador, you never know. It could be one of those cost-free bets that diplomats get up to from time to time. But sincere or not, the remark paid off, because in March 1983 he came to London for a meeting with Mrs. Thatcher, and in her briefing papers, which we put online, there's a little note saying, Mr. Moyoy wanted you to win, which she made a little mark next to. And he comes in and he gives a little speech to her, which really was saying all the right things for Margaret Thatcher. He talks about the government's economic policies in Hungary, and he says profit must be the incentive. It is not for the government to hand out money. The government doesn't have money, he said. Now, Mrs. Thatcher's response, she was delighted with this. She said to him, you could have been quoting one of my own speeches. And actually, quite probably he was. I think that's probably what happened. Somebody got one of her speeches and said, this is what she believes, tell her what she believes. You must never underestimate flattery as a factor in international diplomacy. It can be very effective. Moyoy also renewed a long-standing invitation for the British Prime Minister to visit. Every single meeting with a British minister or Prime Minister included at the end, please do come to Budapest, to which there was usually, yes, I'd love to, but I'm not sure. On this occasion, she slightly warmed it up, the British answer. She said, well, I've got an election to fight and I might lose, which perhaps a subtle reminder that he didn't really have elections to worry about, that he wouldn't be knocked out by an election. But she did say, one day I'll come. And I think there was a warming. It was beginning to be within view. Now at this stage, the pipeline issue was out of the way. It was resolved, in fact. The sanctions were dropped completely. George Shultz became American Secretary of State, partly because of the Falklands War, in fact. His predecessor was damaged by it. And Caspar Weinberger became much, much closer to Mrs. Thatcher. They became powerfully close at this point. He helped Britain deeply during the Falklands War. And when he saw her in September 1982, there was great emollients on both sides. And he was probably the biggest single threat to the US position on differentiation, on this idea that Hungary and other European states on the east should be treated a little more gently. And she wins that election, of course. She wins re-election very, very comfortably in 1983, and we see Margaret Thatcher's second term in office beginning, huge majority, an obvious position of great strength. She now means to make her mark internationally. I'm convinced of that. This was her moment. She was now somebody with a tremendous majority, a great mandate. She had much more confidence in foreign policy. The war, particularly in the Falklands, meant everybody wanted to see her. She was getting invitations from all sides. She also got an agenda now, I think, very clearly. She had always been an opponent of détente. She became leader of the Conservative Party in 1975 and immediately made a speech, very bravely, saying she didn't believe in it at all. And that was the high point of détente, the period of Nixon and Kissinger and Ford, when it was considered by everybody the only way to go. There was only really one other big politician who opposed détente anywhere, and that was Ronald Reagan. And it's one reason why they were so close later, but they had both at the beginning stood out very bravely against it. They each recognized the other. One of the letters we have online at our site is the very first one he ever wrote to her in April 1975. It was on the day Saigon fell. It's very symbolic, that day. It's one of the most humiliating moments in US foreign policy history. And I don't know if you remember seeing or have ever seen documentaries, pictures of American helicopters taking off from the embassy with people hanging on the bottom of the helicopters to escape. Desperately depressing and humiliating. And he talks of the shadows lengthening in that letter. That was his first ever exchange with her. They both saw détente as a dangerous slide. This is where it ended, in humiliation and disaster. The West making one-sided, self-defeating concessions from a position of weakness. Concessions also that carried an implication, a disastrous idea that East and West were equivalent, really. There was no great difference between them, finally. Great powers playing games. And Thatcher and Reagan shared a strategy in response to this. They said, rebuild defences, military and moral. Assert our interests and values forcefully, clearly, confidently. Don't pretend that everybody's the same. We actually should believe in what we believe and say it. The goal, however, was always security, not supremacy, still less conflict. And in summer 1983, beginning this second term, in such a strong position, Margaret Thatcher reviewed British foreign policy on East-West. We were close to the end of an agonizing struggle to deploy cruise and Pershing missiles in the West. This had divided many countries. Britain, Germany and Italy were about to install these missiles. There'd been huge domestic opposition. The Soviet leadership was falling into physical decay. Brezhnev had been ill for a long time, then died. Andropov, his successor, very quickly became ill as well and disappeared, really. The US also was entering an election year in which not much policy gets made. So the result, actually, she felt was a sort of vacuum, a dangerous situation. And she had a chance to influence things as well. And what she did was make a series of speeches in 1983, opening the door to conversations with the Soviets. She had to do it several times because the press didn't expect the Iron Lady to say things like this at all. When she made a speech about East-West, they immediately said, oh, that's just Thatcher going on about how much she hates the Soviets. If she says something different, they edit that out in their mind. So she has to say it several times and get people actually to take the journalists on one side and say, here's the important bit of the speech, I've underlined it in red for you. And eventually they kind of get there. She goes to Washington at the end of September '83 and makes one of these speeches. she has the whole administration sitting in front of her when she does it. She very pointed. This was the A-list audience. And these are her exact words. "We have to deal with the Soviet Union," she said, "but we must deal with it not as we would like it to be, but as it is. We live on the same planet and we have to go on sharing it. We stand ready, therefore, if and when the circumstances are right, to talk to the Soviet leadership." Now, there was something else, I think, behind her stance here, the change of position, that she did not whisper at the time. And it was so highly classified then that even now we haven't got documents about it, but we know a lot about it all the same. Britain had acquired a KGB agent, a man called Oleg Gordievsky. He was head of the KGB's London operation. He had very high access. And he had told the British, and we had told the Americans, of a very secret KGB program that really alarmed and startled us. It was codenamed Operation Reagen. And Reagen was watching key decision makers in Britain and America and other Western countries with nuclear weapons to see where they went in case they were making preparations for a first strike on the Soviet Union. Now, we had no plans for a first strike on the Soviet Union. It's bizarre, the idea that this should even cross the minds of the Soviets. But Gordievsky convinced us that they actually thought we might. And that was just stunning. There was astonishment that this could possibly be true. Thatcher, I'm sure, believed what Gordievsky told her. She went in September '83 to see Reagan. At the same time she made that speech, she had, of course, meetings. And I think what she did then was put this insight to Reagan. And she was better placed to persuade him of it than just about anyone. And there was an exercise, a big NATO exercise, later in 1983, that was deliberately scaled back to remove the role of some leaders in it. It was called Able Archer. It still scared the hell out of the Soviets. It was partly meant to, I suspect, as well, because it simulated the release of nuclear weapons. And later on, there's a debate actually in the historiography, some of you may have read about it, the Soviet war scare of 1983. They seemed to have been terrified by Able Archer. They really were. They thought, this is it, you know. And we had now got the message, the Soviets are actually a bit scared of us. And that, I think, is probably the biggest single shift that had happened in Reagan and Thatcher's thinking about the East since they both rose to high office. It really is a significant change, and it does in itself require them to adjust a bit, I think. If the Soviets are scared, we probably should calibrate and recalibrate. So with Andropov now out of sight, and he's clearly very ill, perhaps the time has come to revive that Hungarian project, do you think? Now, the British were not the only people to reach this conclusion. As with many good ideas, just about everybody had it at the same time and thought it was their own. The Hungarian government saw the moment, and it began cranking out invitations and reviving invitations as fast as the machines in the diplomatic corps would do it. One of the very first people to arrive is the British Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe. He arrives just after the Soviets shoot down a Korean airliner. In September 1983, KAL 007 goes off course over a sensitive part of the Soviet eastern domain, and it's shot out of the sky, a jumbo jet. Staggering moment, tremendous shock in the West. Very aggressive thing to do. And how, in previous years, you can imagine that visit being cancelled. We'd have said, in protest of this shocking barbarism, we won't allow Howe to come. In fact, we go ahead with it. That in itself was the significance of the visit in the end, that he just arrived. Next to come, George Bush, Vice President to Ronald Reagan. He meets Katar just a few days after Howe has been in Budapest. It all goes very well, and in fact we published online for the first time the American record of the meeting. It's a very long record. George Bush sends it off. Then he makes a mistake. Bush goes off to Vienna immediately afterwards and makes a long speech in which he praises Hungary and Romania. He brackets the two, which Katar absolutely hates him for. And he also really pats Hungary and Romania on the head in relation to the Soviets and says differentiation works so well. He uses the word. Now, in a way, I guess we were pleased to hear a US official use the word, because it meant that our argument on that score was sort of gaining ground, but it was guaranteed to embarrass the Hungarian government, to put it that way. It was so blunt. So this went down very, very badly in Budapest. No, you don't do this. Now, Mrs. Thatcher ordered her officials to accept the Hungarian invitation to visit on the 4th of November. And we have, thanks to my brilliant intern Anita, all the telegrams from the Foreign Ministry on this side. If ever you're going to study diplomacy, I think you have to look at both sides of the street. It's impossible. Diplomacy is definitely not something you do on your own in a darkened room. There have to be other people involved. And we are able, therefore, to see what the other side thought. And the ambassador expressed great joy in his telegrams. Literally, the words "great joy" appear. This is a huge coup for him. Mrs. Thatcher is going to come. But immediately there's reserve on the Hungarian side. Look what happened with Bush. Oh dear, this might go wrong. We've got to make sure the British don't do the same thing. And we have difficulty on the British side, having waited for years to accept the invitation, to get them to come back and say yes, okay. But finally, after 10 days of rushing around, we get an okay, and Mrs. Thatcher announces it in another one of these speeches about how we must live on the same planet. 14th of November 1983, and she adds, on the same planet, and I'm going to Hungary. That's kind of what that speech was about. There was another argument then. 3 Western leaders are summoned all at once. Having waited for 50 years to get any, suddenly you've got 3 coming along in a bunch. Thatcher, Kohl, and the Italian Prime Minister of the day, whose name escapes me. I do know who it was, that's just a crude joke about Italian politics. Really the choice is Thatcher or Kohl, to be honest. Germany is now obviously the bigger player in Hungarian terms, bigger than any other European state. But in those days, in the Cold War, particularly if you wanted to reach the Reagan administration, there really wasn't all that much choice, I think, about going for Thatcher. And she also had iconic status to a degree by now. People noticed this woman, this powerful woman figure. She was famous the world over, especially after the Falklands War. And that supplied a bit of plus for her too, I think. It meant it played a bit better in Hungary. It's very striking that when she came to the market, which I'll mention a bit later, she was mobbed. People were very impressed with Margaret Thatcher. They knew immediately who this fair-haired woman was, and so on. Kohl didn't quite have that degree of glamour about him. And the Hungarian files show one other factor, which is very interesting, I think. The Hungarians don't really ask the Soviets whether they should do this or not. Kádár doesn't go off to Andropov and say, can I just invite Kohl, Thatcher and Krácsy, please? Anyway, Andropov's lying on his hospital bed. He's dying, actually. Kádár just does it. But he's a bit isolated. He's a bit left on his own if he goes ahead with all these invitations and nobody else knows about it on the eastern side. So what does he do? One of the documents Anita found is copied to Willi Stoff. Willi Stoff was the East German Prime Minister. Kádár lined up the East Germans in advance to back this visit. He knew he could get heat afterwards and that what he should do is at least have one friend out there. And I think that will have influenced him in favour of Thatcher too, because one thing the East Germans would not have wanted would have been Helmut Kohl as the first big guest in this succession of Western leaders going through Budapest. So Kohl pushed away. It's going to be Thatcher. She will be the first one. Big deal. Now once the date is finalised, early January they begin to plan seriously. We have a lot of documents from this planning phase on both sides of the issue. We published them online. Kádár's documents showed that his advisors thought that Mrs. Thatcher, they thought pretty well of Mrs. Thatcher. They quoted her, they said she's shrewdly anti-communist. And this comes through again and again in Eastern appreciations of Mrs. Thatcher. They basically thought she knows what we're about. She sees through us, actually. They really did feel they had something to hide, and Mrs. Thatcher didn't have any of this nonsense that East and West were the same or something. She knew full well that they weren't the same, and that actually there were all sorts of things wrong in the East, and she had spotted what they were, actually. And so they had a grudging admiration. The East Germans were very similar. Part of the British briefing is there too, and the interesting thing I find about it is that the Foreign Office wanted Mrs. Thatcher to play down the Hungarian Revolution. The first line in their briefing was, the Hungarian Revolution took place over 27 years ago, they said, as if it's just a little thing long away. Why did we not mention the revolution? It's really not a big deal. She crossed that out in a big blue biro and sent a letter. And the letter said basically, such a statement might create the impression that we were seeking to play down the significance of the event. No. As we shall see, she was not going to have that. She wasn't going to play it down. True, this is supposed to be launching a rapprochement, this visit. She doesn't want to make it into a huge fight, but equally, the way you do that is not to play these things down. She has only time for one speech, and we've put all the drafts online, you can see them. She drafts intensively. John sat in many speech writing sessions, and I sat with these huge speeches called her memoirs, and they could be grueling, I can tell you. You can see in some of the notes with these how long they went on. But basically, she always got away in these sessions. She knew what she wanted to say. And she expresses it very neatly in one of these notes. She says, "I think at some point we should make clear how much we value our way of life, and that there can be no retreat underlined from it." That's the real essence of what she wants to say in that speech. Yes, we live on the same planet, but we are not giving up our position. She also looked very closely at the detail of her visit. Everything she was going to do, every place she went. She had this thing about visiting communist countries. She thought they would try and use the visit in some way to make it seem like she was approving. This is the other side of the equation from the speech. You can show as well as say, can't you? The pictures could be more damaging than what you actually say, in fact. So you must make sure they don't put you in front of something that embarrasses you later, in front of some big Soviet emblem or something like that. She watches every aspect of the programme. She knows too that when she's here she's going to be bugged, literally. She's in a government guest house. I can tell you, I don't have anybody's testimony, but I know she'd have gone around going like that. She would not have said a word anywhere where she could be overheard that was at all sensitive, because she knew, quite rightly, absolutely for certain, there would have been somebody with a tape recorder and a record would have been on Kada's desk that night, if not sooner. So basically, she's always very nervous of these visits and watches every detail with care. She flies to Hungary on the 2nd of February after Prime Minister's questions. I don't know if any of you ever watched Prime Minister's questions, whether you've seen it on TV. It's this sort of bun fight. Famously, the Hungarian Parliament, built on the model of the British, in 1904, do you know of the great inkpot fight in the Parliament, where deputies lobbed inkpots at each other, and it was famous, the Hungarian Parliament, as the inkpot place. I went there today and I looked for the inkpots, and unfortunately they weren't there. But the style of the Parliament had kind of changed, hadn't it? The Hungarian Parliament in 1984 wasn't a place with inkpots. It had nothing. It was kind of dead. And when she meets György Lazar, the Prime Minister, who is her formal opposite number, of course, not Kada, he's just a humble party leader. He isn't, of course, finally in charge. No, Lazar is the big man. And the meetings are nothing. They are just, ponderous readouts of the standard party line, and she goes through it, says, yeah, thank you very much, she says yes, and nothing there. What goes much better is this kind of stuff. She has it all planned out. The Hungarian government does the right kind of pomp. She goes to Heroes Square, she lays a wreath. She goes to the military cemetery at Solimar. The snow on the ground, she's in furs, she looks great. It really does work well in terms of TV, the press love it. She always thinks about the photos. She goes to the cover market and she buys honey and paprika, and somebody last night corrected me and said no garlic as well. But whatever it was, I can tell you, cooked up as a meal, it would have been indigestible. Nonetheless, it kind of was appropriate to her. And when she paid for them, they tried to give her the stuff. She said, no, you mustn't give me this, I pay. So she gets out this brown envelope, and it's full of notes. The ambassadors give it, she sort of hands notes out to the, Then she goes off to a complex of flats built by a British building firm. And always we were told in the West that Hungary had a bit of a free market economy, so she asks ordinary people questions about these flats. And it turns out they don't really own them. Everybody said in Britain they own their own flats, but actually you didn't actually own a flat in Hungary in 1984. The government really owned it. It was all a sham, this idea of private ownership. And there was a very poignant, sad little visit afterwards. She went to a ceramics museum, and she was shown round by an impoverished member of the sort of pre-war Hungarian aristocracy who had a beautiful suit, but it was a bit worn out. And everything, he was brilliantly turned out, he was elegant, he was charming, he was dispossessed and sad, and he was like somebody out of fiction. He couldn't have been summed up better by a novelist. And the whole visit encapsulates all these different aspects of Hungary. It was brilliantly put together. And the Hungarians had played ball, one must say. The Hungarian government hadn't tried to trick her. It hadn't cheated her. It had made the shots look good. Diplomacy was working. But what about Kada? Of course she's going to see Kada. She's due to meet him at noon on the one full day of her visit. But at the last minute, the Hungarians send their regrets. Sadly, unfortunately, he wasn't going to be available after all. It was a pity. She'd come all this way, never mind. Bang! Huge prime ministerial explosion. I'm not coming to Budapest, I'll not see Katar. And suddenly, oh, actually, he's available after all. It's okay. Yes, we'll go and see him. They had this is what the diplomats call a pas de deux. You know, it's a ballet. You twinkle around. No harm is done. And in fact, when she comes in, Katar says, first of all, he politely asks permission to smoke, which any gentleman, of course, does. He smokes all the time, and he says, no, I mustn't smoke if you don't want me to. And the record, we only have the Hungarian record, actually, but it says quite clearly the ask. It doesn't say whether she agreed, but I imagine she would have been wise enough to do so. Now, the record is online. It's a fascinating record. I won't try and read all through it or anything like that. What is striking about it is after an initial exchange of courtesies about how we had helped with money in 1982, they really get down to it. And she says, look, I'm here because I think we need to improve relations between East and West urgently. We need to talk to each other. Things are, in a bad situation. Basically, the Soviets are out for the count. Andropov is ill. Reagen's going to an election. The smaller countries have a role to play. We really must try and warm things up a bit. Katar is very clever in all his handlings of people in the West. He says, oh, you're so generous to say Hungary and Britain are smaller countries. You are much bigger than Hungary. We are really small. You are a bigger country. Very clever thing to say. He also attacks Reagen. He says Reagen's no good. No. He's not like you say. He's not out for peace. He's not a good man. And then he quotes the Bush visit. And they talk on and on about the Bush visit, how stupid Bush was. Had a very foolish thing to say about Hungary and Romania. Ceausescu is not what we're about at all. I am not like Ceausescu, is one of his lessons there. And that's true, to be fair to Katar. He was not quite like that. She also denies, fighting back, that the Soviets are scared. He says this again and again. The Soviets are really scared of the West. She says, no, well, they don't look like that. They don't look scared to me at all. But of course, we've seen that she does actually, in one respect, think maybe they are. So the Gordievsky revelation, of course, she can hardly say, but somebody told us they are. She's going to have to keep this pretty silent, pretty secret. She doesn't let it fall into a kind of slogging match, though, in which we just fight in private, the battles you fight in public. She swiftly moves on and says, well, you're not worried that the military are getting to be really big in the USSR. Now Andropov is ill. He's really ill, isn't he? Aren't the military taking over? Isn't that why that aircraft was shot down? Why the Korean plane was taken down? The military are calling the shots now. And what Katar does is then give a survey of Soviet leaders back to Khrushchev. He knew them all. He was the first person, probably the only person she ever met, who could talk with that kind of knowledge of the whole Soviet experience post-war. And he just goes through them, telling her what they were like, how rough but also kind of effective Khrushchev had been, what Brezhnev was like, how sentimental Brezhnev was, and so on. He acknowledges Andropov's illness, but he claimed he was still mentally alert. In fact, he was only days from death, so there's a limit to how much candor he can have. At the end of it all, she closes, she thanks him, the business is done. She says something interesting. She says, if the international situation gets really dangerous, can I send you a message? Doesn't say what that is, but presumably some sort of calming down message. And Katar is probably a bit surprised to hear that. He says, well, okay, yeah, fair enough. He notes this exchange carefully when he goes to report to the Hungarian cabinet. We have that report online. There's one last thing in this meeting. I've quoted the record from the Hungarian side. We don't yet have the British one. But Mrs. Thatcher's memoirs contain an account of that record, which we used when we were writing them. And there was one other topic she brought up. And I've kind of given you a hint as to what that was. The Foreign Office said, don't mention the revolution. Long time ago, Mrs. Thatcher, 27 years or no, most people have forgotten it, I expect. She brings up Imre Nagy. She says, what happened about Imre Nagy then? You know, I mean, you killed him, didn't you? Kind of thing. And Katar responds saying, no, it wasn't me. I didn't do it, it was the Soviets. They were the ones. She just brings it up. So one can fairly say, to summarize all this, when she goes east, Mrs. Thatcher goes out of her way to avoid the language of détente. She wants to bring the two sides together, but do it differently. She is not going to blur the lines or pretend there are no differences. If anything, she's going to draw the lines more emphatically and with great care. The point was to do business across the divide, not to ignore its existence or talk it away. And very definitely, one of her key motives, not to do anything that plays to the corrosive, but very common view in the West, that the two sides really are the same. They're converging, or maybe they're just the same from the beginning. They're just great powers doing what great powers do. They have their rhetorics, their ideology, but actually they're just the same under the skin. The thing about Kissinger, for example, Henry Kissinger was a brilliant man and never spoke of East and West as intellectually, morally as valuable or something, but he did sound and look a bit like a cynic who was playing the game with great self-satisfaction. And she wants to get away from that. Kissinger is almost the emblem of what Reagan and Thatcher are not about in their approach to the East. They want a sort of sincerity to shine through. They are not cynics playing a game. This is serious, real life. They believe what they believe. They are responsible. They want to see peace. But equally, they are not shading the differences. There really is a difference too. Now, Margaret Thatcher's trip to Budapest was a kind of road test of this post-détente approach. It's the first time that they do this. It's before the first meeting, of course, between Reagan and Gorbachev. Gorbachev isn't on the scene. And it showed that it could work for both sides, as effective diplomacy must. The Hungarians got something out of this too. Kadar, if he resented the discussion of Nagy, gave no sign at all. He just brushed it away. He was used to people saying rude things about Nagy, I explained, if not in Hungary, then outside. He was a tough guy. And although there was criticism from the Czechs, who say of the Hungarians a flowery phrase, they are jumping somersaults on Reagan's trampoline. That's what they said of the Hungarian government. But they brushed that away, and the East Germans, prepared in advance, say, no, 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 this was a good thing, having Thatcher around. No, no, that was Kadar did the right thing. On the British side, we love it. We love it. It plays so well. These pictures of Thatcher in the market, Thatcher in furs, all that goes down terribly well. The British TV are there in strength. It plays brilliantly against the image that people had of Margaret Thatcher as the cold warrior. If you move away from your existing sort of position, there's always a lot of attention paid to you. That worked extremely well. And she was, in that sense, I think she learned a lesson that was going to come in handy later, because just before the 1987 general election, when she was re-elected again, she goes to Moscow. And you get on a bigger version of a kind of Budapest-style visit, right down to the fur hat. And those pictures were sensational for Moscow. This was a sort of road test. And I have to say, it was politically very advantageous, whatever else this was. We mustn't reduce it to party politics, but this certainly was a very good piece of PR from a British point of view. Now, I've gone on a long time. I want to close. I'm going to close taking you back to 1956. Britain had its own crisis in 1956. The Suez intervention, the Suez War. It became a potent symbol of British decline. We couldn't pull it off. And many believe that the West divisions over our intervention with the French had given the Soviets a freer hand to crush the Hungarian Revolution. The two events then had kind of interacted in a malignant way. Curiously, Margaret Thatcher had ended up kind of removing the effects of Suez. The Falklands War had overturned the long shadow of that event in British politics. A kind of ancient wound, to change the metaphor, had healed at last. And if she hadn't succeeded, of course, in the Falklands War, she wouldn't have been in Budapest as Prime Minister either. She would have lost office. Now, the wound inflicted on you will hear in 1956 was surely deeper than the wound inflicted on Britain. And visiting in 1984, the prospects of healing much, much more remote. Who would have guessed that only 5 years later, Imre Nagy will be reburied in triumph following a ceremonial funeral in Hero Square, where old Kadar, now powerless and his mind wandering, was left wandering his home saying, is today the day? Is the funeral really today? They tried to keep it from him, apparently. But Thatcher's visit bore fruit sooner than 1989. There was a new British, indeed Western emphasis on Eastern Europe. All those arguments about differentiation were over. We were really going to engage in Eastern Europe. She pressed it powerfully, this case, of Western allies. There were further trips east. There was deeper interest, engagement and understanding on all levels. She made a famous speech at Bruges in September 1988, now remembered as founding British Euroscepticism. But it contained an important passage on Eastern Europe too. She reproached people in the West, very common this, who talked about Europe and the European identity as if it just meant the West and the European community as it then was. And she said, no, that's just careless shorthand, actually. Think it through. It has a deeper meaning. There is more than just us when we talk about Europe, not just the European community. And this was not a sudden late insight on her part, or some shallow tactic to stop European integration or something like that. She'd always done everything she could to ensure that Britain and its allies did not fall into thinking and talking of East and West as permanent divides. She said, and let me close on her words and I will open to questions, "The European community is one manifestation of that European identity. It is not the only one. We must never forget that east of the Iron Curtain, peoples who once enjoyed a full share of European culture, freedom and identity have been cut off from their roots. We shall always look on Warsaw, Prague and Budapest as great European cities."